Emotional algebra, where the heart meets the math. What is integral is derivative as you figure out your path. Power plus emotions equals more than you can see. Listening to the wisdom of our host, Dr.
Welcome. This is the first episode of what we hope will be many more episodes of Emotional Algebra with Dr. E, a podcast to help us all become better people. My name is Andrew Tavani. I'm your co-host.
And I'm Dr. E.
And let's get right to it. Our expert, Dr. Eric Fisher, better known as Dr. E to many of the people he's helped in the past. You may also recognize him from some of his TV appearances over the years in places like the Fox TV networks, NBC, the Weather Channel, AccuWeather, and many more. Dr. E, I have to ask you, what inspired you to do this podcast, this type of a podcast in the first place?
Well, Andrew, I've always thought about doing a podcast, and the biggest deterrent was the more I waited, the more podcasts began to emerge. And I started to question myself, could my podcast make a difference? Is it just going to be one more additional podcast? And as I asked myself that over time, I said, that's not a really good reason to not do one. And then still that feeling of fear and apprehension of starting something that, I've done a lot of things, from doing different talks and presentations and trying to, develop TV shows, working in the news, and life didn't necessarily take me where I wanted it to, but I do believe it took me where I needed to be.
When you came to me with this project, we went over the material and whatnot. And obviously I thought that there's the potential for this to be life-changing for people. And I have to tell you, though, also, I was very intrigued by the name, Emotional Algebra, Dr. E. Can you tell people what that means? Where did it come from?
Right. Over the years, I've been doing my work for about 30 years now. And I'd often see and ask people, if you weren't in my office, what would you be doing differently? We hear the stories of when you're working with families and couples and even individuals of how they behave so much differently in different situations. So what I started to really bring people's attention to, I said, there's different variables and different, what I call demand characteristics of various situations that are going to evoke different responses. I said, but you're not realizing that. You're just doing these things. So where do these equations come from? Where are you evaluating the variables that will affect your output, affect your behavior? So what I help them to look at is that there are stimuli and triggers in the outside world. Those stimuli and triggers are affecting, influencing internal emotions, beliefs, attitudes that are affected by our history, by our assessment of culture, our assessment of where we fit into our culture, and even those current events or shifts in the world around us. All those are important variables that people don't often consider and they don't assess. They just act and they respond or they react. I often teach people that when you understand all the variables inside and you can evaluate those with the variables outside, then you can respond to life instead of reacting to life. If we look at the world around us, we see more and more people reacting from emotions that they haven't really been taught to understand. So one of the things we're going to talk about is, what are the purpose of emotions? What are the value of emotions? Because most people see emotions as things that we just have to bury inside and get rid of. And then through that, we start to understand what contributed to the creation of our belief systems and attitude systems that really run our lives unconsciously more than we're consciously aware. And through that, as we can understand ourselves better, and we can also understand why people are doing things in the outside world and what's driving them, then we can make better evaluations of situations to form better outcomes for ourselves, the people around us, and hopefully the goal is that that'll spread to our communities, our culture, and the world at large.
Very interesting. I hear the words variables, equations. Dr. E, it sounds like a lot of mental math. Will there be a pop quiz at the end?
There may be, but the pop quiz may happen after you turn the show off, when life comes up and happens for you rather than to you.
All right, so let's talk about what we're going to go over today. In this first episode, you're going to introduce the concept of power and the model of power that maybe people have not really considered in their daily lives, or not considered on a conscious level.
Right.
Do you want to give a little preview of what's to come here?
Well, what I want viewers to keep in mind is that in order to help us have these discussions throughout the podcast as we continue, it's important to give people the model. When I'm working with people, I'm often saying that I want us to be able to speak the same language. And too many times, I think in therapy and in life in general, people are speaking different languages, so they're not understanding each other. So I present these models and the 2 models of power so that we can see why our cultures have so much conflict and struggle and why we feel so lost and overwhelmed in them. And then also give a solution through the other way we can look at power. That to me is what people are coming to this world with. While we're socialized in the first model, the hierarchical model we're going to talk about today. Also, then after that, we're going to talk about relationships and how relationships play into our assessments of self and power and how we can affect and influence those relationships positively. We're going to talk about conflict escalation and what happens there. We're going to talk about the roles people play in the world. And like I said, these are things to come in future episodes. And I really hope you'll all hang in there through the end, because as we get through this discussion, then you'll see more easily how we can wade through these situations that feel so challenging to us all every day.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, these are some new concepts for people to wrap their heads around. And to help make that easier to do, Dr. E, you have some visuals. So what do you say? Should we dive right into it?
Let's dive on in, Andrew.
Okay.
All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about to really understand our interactions and ourselves, we all want to look at and understand the way we look at power. So as I said, the first model of power we're going to talk about today is what I call a hierarchical model of power. It says that everybody basically has a different level of power. So if you're a listener out there listening to this, basically what I have on the screen are 5 different size circles, from the biggest to the smallest or smallest to the biggest. They're all different colors. The color doesn't really make a difference. It just denotes that these are different people. We are all unique beings. The idea of that hierarchical model of power is that everybody has a different level of power. And we're supposed to kind of in this life figure out, where do I fit in this hierarchy? The other thing to understand is there are multiple hierarchies, from our family to our work setting, to when we're kids in school, or peer groups, even adult peer groups, extended family, our family if we're parents, and our kids. All these things are different dichotomies. And how do those different dichotomies affect our behaviors, our attitudes, our emotions? So the first question often to ask is, how do we get power in this model? And how we get power in this model is basically by usurping, undermining, or looking to other people in power to promote us or demote us up and down that system. It can also be that people beneath us might promote us or demote us up and down that hierarchy. The idea of this is that we never really learn to believe in ourselves. Other people basically define our power. And that's a big struggle, because we're often battling forces outside ourselves just to feel a shred of power within. And that's what people often don't catch. And that's why, to me, we're more reactive rather than responsive in life.
Now, Dr. E, let me ask you, when you introduce this to your patients, do you ever ask them which one of these balls or circles they envision themselves or perceive themselves to be in?
I do, and that's a great question, Andrew, because one of the things we want to look at is, where do we fit in this? Because again, a lot of these questions I'm asking are really unconscious to them. They've never evaluated those questions. Just as when you and I first talked about this stuff and you really became intrigued by these powers, you said, I never thought about it that way. And what I want viewers to see is a lot of things we're going to talk about are easy and simple concepts to look at, but we just never considered it in that way. So which circle or sphere of power do you want to be? And when people answer that question, that's already given me information. So what I want you to ask yourself, viewer, is and or listener, is if you're here in this podcast listening right now or watching right now, which circle would you envision yourself to be? The big one, the second one next to that, second smallest next to that, all the way down to the smallest. Okay. The next
and Dr. E, but when you ask this, what do most people say? I would assume people want to be that big blue ball.
Well, they do. Sometimes the most revealing and powerful answer I get is when I'm asking a family or working with a family and I'm asking the kids which circle they want to be, often the kids will say, I want to be the big circle. And I can look at the parents and say, and that's why you have a problem. Not because it's a problem wanting to be a big circle, but in this whole concept of power, you can see that power becomes a commodity. It becomes a resource to be bought and sold or traded or manipulated or stolen or abused. And that's the issue, is that there's never enough to go around in this. So in this first question, as soon as they answer which circle they want to be, whether they want to be the biggest, and there are a lot of adults who don't want to be the big circle because of answers we'll talk about later on. They just don't often want that responsibility.
Yeah, when you brought this up and I first saw it, my thought was I'd like to be that big blue circle too. And then I thought for a second, wait, I remember, I think it was Spider-Man's uncle or Peter Parker's uncle who said, with great power comes great responsibility. So maybe other people are like that. And as you're saying, adults don't want to be that big blue circle because there's a lot of pressure with that.
Exactly. And too many times parents, as soon as you have a child, you are forced. Again, that's where people below you in power often promote you, whether you want to go or not, into those higher spheres of power and spheres of control and responsibility. So that's again, a really important issue to look at and address, is how little we really feel we have the power to address our own sense of self and where we belong in these hierarchies. So the next question to ask is, which sphere of power do you feel like? Often people have a big disparity between which circle they want to be and which circle they feel like. There's so many times that I watch people's eyes. So when we're having these introductions to these models, and I'm watching their eyes on the screen, there's so many times I see people whose eyes are looking right at that small circle, but they won't say, I feel like the small circle, until I ask them about it. Because even there's shame, feelings of failure, embarrassment about saying, I feel powerless, I feel small. So they're not even able to be honest with themselves, and often the place that's most important to be honest. So that's a really important piece to look at, is that if we're not speaking honestly outside ourselves, we're not going to be able to be honest with ourselves inside. So beyond that, the next piece or question would be, which sphere of power do other people see us? Which circle do other people see you as? And in that, then we're seeing that these are the situations that often we assess where people see us different than where they might see us. So that is our own sense of, well, how do I see myself with other people? Sometimes they're accurate. I think more times than not, they're not really accurate, because our view of self comes from within. We then project it to the outside world, and then we see what we want to see, or we see what we believe, or we see what we've been shown. And again, even that helps us to see how really powerless we are to understand our relationships in regard to other people and the relationships they have with us.
And how can people know really where they fit in that? I mean, there's like you mentioned, there's many different contexts in life. There's the work context. So maybe somebody has a position of higher power at work, and maybe at home that differs slightly. How can people know where they are and be honest with themselves, Dr. E, as you said, and understand where they really fit on that model? And what can they do if they're not happy with where they are?
And I think that's part of the mystery, is all this is changing. So what terms I put to these is our ideal, feel, and real selves. And what I help people to see is the more disparity between your ideal, in other words, which circle you want to be, and your feel, which circle you feel like, often the more distress that people feel. So as the viewer or listener, be kind of conscious of yourself. Continue to ask yourself these questions. And what I want you to do for homework is, throughout this time between now and the next podcast episode, be looking at the world around you and be mindful of your own assessment of power. Be mindful of that difference between your ideal, or where you want to be, your feel that you feel inside, and the real, and which power, how people you feel like around you may be giving or taking power. Because these are the things that are going to contribute to your internal conflicts, that are going to lead to your external conflicts. So that's really important at this point. And in this beginning stage of building these models to understand yourself better is just to be observant of self and others and these contextual situations related to your own power.
Interesting, Dr. E. And as far as power goes, you know, what can you tell people, let's say parents who have to guide their children through life and maybe need something done? How should they use this power that they have or not use it?
Well, it's a great question. And it's one that I feel at this point, I think it's important to see how your kids are reactive to you and how you might be reactive to your kids. Often kids are reacting to subconscious cues, behavioral cues, body language. There's so much that I read about people's body language that says so much more than the words that they're using. And I'm often pointing out shifts in behavior. I'm pointing out when people cross their arms, and often I said, did you notice you cross your arms? I can't tell you how many times people have said, well, I'm cold. Or I'll see while they cross their legs and they're like, well, my leg fell asleep. I said, why right at that moment did you cross your legs? Sometimes when people feel threatened, they might stand up so they can look down on that person that they're having the issue with, and the arms crossed. That says a lot. So a lot of our conflicts and issues are driven by cues that we're not even consciously aware of.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. E, does it mean, is there some meaning to crossing your arms? Because sometimes I cross my arms just because it feels comfortable, you know?
Right. And that's the thing. Freud once said long ago, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, you know? But I think the thing to look at here is that often the timing of those movements, this is often protective. Where you cross your legs, are your legs crossed towards somebody? That's opening yourself up, even though a lot of people feel comfortable crossing their legs, which is also protective in some degree and also helps your back. And so there are obviously physiological reasons, but more the emotional reasons is it's protective. So what I'm often looking for is when I'm talking with somebody and their legs are crossed towards me and then they shift and they cross away from me, I bring that up because I want them to look inside and ask, not consciously what's going on, but what unconsciously is going on. And why am I doing what I'm doing at this time? And that's the biggest key is to, like I said, it's about really mindfulness and awareness of self and mindfulness and awareness of what's going on within ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah, interesting. And I think for people listening and watching, that goes back to something you said earlier. Your homework here is to just be observant, right? Observe your body motions in various scenarios, right?
Right. Exactly. And that's critical. That's critical to really self-understanding. So as we're moving through this model here, you see that now we have the big two circles. I could have put it in everyone, but inside of the top two circles, I put a small circle, a really small circle. And what this idea starts to introduce the idea is of an imposter syndrome. I would say 95% plus of us feel like imposters in our life. We feel like we don't belong with the power we have, especially parents, as we were talking about. And that's really one of the issues I'm helping parents to see is how often do you really feel like an imposter? How often do you feel like you have no business being a parent? How often does a manager or a boss or a president or a doctor or even a minister, all these people in positions of high status power feel like if people knew the real me, they would have no business listening to anything I say? I go through that and I've been through that. And it can feel very scary. The idea of this is that often we have to show one side. Again, we want to show our ideal self or even what we feel is representative of our status power. We want to show that to the outside world while we hide what's inside. And so many people who have risen to power often can feel crumbled or, compressed under these demands of that status they feel they're supposed to live with and what they're supposed to aspire to and be. And that, again, is that idea of distress and dis-ease. So the other thing I want people to look at here is how do our perceptions of power, how do our beliefs, our attitudes, and our emotions, and the way we look at the world hierarchically affect our disease states? Because we know that psychological stress contributes to physical stress because of the chemicals that are elicited in the body under stress, as well as wearing down our immune system that then allows potentially different disease structures to come in. So we want to understand and look at that. Maybe as I change the way I look at power, maybe the way I change the way I look at myself and really see this through the longer lens, the big lens and the bigger picture, then maybe, again, I change myself. I change my sleep patterns. I change my health. I change the aches and pains. Again, I can't tell you how many people who, when we start doing this work and they understand what makes them tick, they feel so much better. That issues they've had for years and years of time seem to melt away, and they're just not an issue anymore because they've resolved the dis-ease inside. And that dis-ease migrated not just from emotionally to physically to much better quality of life as the outcome.
Interesting. There's an interconnectivity to all of this, it seems like.
There is.
Yeah. So going back to the hierarchical model of power and the imposter syndrome there, is it ever a case where people in the lower end of this hierarchy have an imposter syndrome, or is that mainly confined to the upper end?
Oh, it's throughout. Like I said, that little circle could be in every single sphere on that progression, the hierarchy, and that's the issue: is when does that imposter syndrome start? Again, where I'd want people to look at is, again, the different hierarchies you might be in. So let's say you grow up as the youngest child in the family, and then in your school, at school you're pretty smart, but at home they still treat you like the little sibling. So even though you're smart and you might want to be seen as smart and intelligent, you still feel like, well, if they knew that I'm just the little brother or little sister, or my siblings tell me this or call me this, or my parents are doing this to me, if they really knew how I really felt or how other people that are important to me see me, they'd know I have no business with this. That's then what often, again, drives those behaviors that often might be arrogant, aggressive, flippant, avoidant, those defenses that we project towards the outside world that we're going to get into more in future episodes. But this helps you to see why the differences in our status and our power, and often our imposter syndromes, again, the difference between our ideal or real and feel, why those issues become so manifested and why they contribute to so many problems and issues in this hierarchically bound world that we live in.
Got it. Okay, so some key takeaways here that I'm seeing, Dr. E. First of all, be observant, be aware of your behavior as you go through life, right? And maybe ways that you haven't been as aware. And secondly, understand that hierarchical model of power. This is very common in life, right? Now, people may not have had these terms to apply to.
Exactly.
So, Dr. E, I know you've got a whole nother model to introduce to viewers on the next episode. Do you want to give us a little preview now, or should we wait till next time on emotional?
Well, I think I kind of teased it on the screen there for a second before I backed it off there. But yeah, next episode, we're going to talk about that equity model. And remember, through this whole journey, what we're doing all this for is to give us all a common language to speak from. And as we have that common language and understanding, then we can talk together. And then we can, again, learn as we listen and understand, we can be more responsive versus reactive. So in this next episode, remember, we're building the models over time. We'll touch on that equity model of power and hopefully see why we might want to live in a different way of seeing the world than these hierarchical models that tend to be more destructive. So until next time,